Welcome to our webinar about the market for American Sign Language or ASL Interpreting. I am super excited that this is happening. We do a lot of studies and webinars here at Nimdzi Insights, but this one is quite special to me. When I first started looking into the market for ASL, I was surprised to find that there was so much that I did not know. This is such a unique field within our industry and one that I think deserves more attention. So this is why we're here today. As you will have already noticed, this webinar is being interpreted into ASL and also from ASL into English. It was very important to us that when we talk about the ASL market, the whole conversation will also be available in ASL. On that note, also a little heads up about how this webinar will be structured. We will kick things off with a brief presentation by me where we'll talk about the highlights from our study, kind of to set the stage for the panel discussion that we will have later on, where we will then delve deeper into the topic. I've prepared a few questions, but please also feel free to type your own questions in the chat, and we will do our best to address as many of those as possible. I have two wonderful guests with me today. First, we have Robin Horwitz from Interpreter Now and Joshua Pennise from Sorensen Community Interpreting. So let's kick things off with a brief round of introductions, just so you have a better idea of who you're dealing with. Okay, so Robin, why don't you start?
Hello, everyone. My name is Robin. I originally started in the interpreting industry because I was pretty frustrated with my own interpreting services. I was having a hard time getting adequate interpreters for different jobs. So I started the company in 2009 with 4 other partners. And then moving on, we decided to kind of enter into the video remote interpreting and on-site interpreting services niche. And so I've been involved with that for the last 3 years.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Joshua, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Josh Pennise. I'm a certified sign language interpreter. And originally that was my professional path. I got into teaching and training interpreters at the college level for some time, and then joined Sorensen Communications. I just celebrated my 15-year anniversary a couple of weeks ago. I've had a number of roles in Sorensen, but for the past 6 years have been responsible for starting our new on-site and video remote interpreting division. And today my responsibilities continue to be strategy and operation of that business.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And yeah, my name is Sarah Hickey. I'm the VP of Research here at Nimdzi Insights. I have a background in journalism, and I'm also a trained translator, and I have a master's in conference interpreting. At Nimdzi, I run the larger market studies, such as the Nimdzi 100 or the Interpreting Index. And because of my background in interpreting, I'm also responsible for all the interpreting research, including our research into virtual interpreting technology. Okay, so now that we all know each other a little bit better, let's kick things off with a few highlights from our research. First, a few basics and some stats. It is important to note that sign language interpreting is not just another language service offered by companies in the industry. It's a field with unique requirements that evolved out of and grew within the deep roots of deaf history and deaf culture. The Gallaudet Research Institute estimates that there are about 1 million functionally deaf people in the United States. And according to the National Institute on Deafness and Other Communication Disorders, approximately 2 to 3 out of 1,000 children are born with detectable hearing loss in the United States. There are a bit more than 10,000 certified ASL interpreters in the US and Canada that are listed on the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, or RID. So looking at this figure, you can already see that there's a little bit of a disconnect here. If we consider that there are about 1 million functionally deaf people in the US alone, and only a bit more than 10,000 certified ASL interpreters in the US and Canada together. But we will come back to this later. There are only, might I say, 2 universities for the deaf, namely Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., and the National Technical Institute for the Deaf in Rochester, New York. Speaking of which, Rochester, New York has the largest deaf population per capita. The deaf community there grew originally out of New York's former printing industry, which I find fascinating. Deaf people often found work in the print industry as they were able to work next to the loud machines. And today, the community continues to grow because of the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, and also because, thanks to the high concentration of deaf people, there's a higher awareness and acceptance of deaf culture in the broader community that attracts deaf and hard of hearing individuals who have perhaps felt a bit isolated in their previous neighborhoods. So just to set the stage a little bit of what we're talking about here. I already mentioned in the introduction that there were many things that surprised me when I first started looking into this field. And one of those things was the size of the market. We estimate the market for ASL interpreting services in the US in 2021 at between 900 million to 1.2 billion US dollars. The graph that you see here shows the estimated size of the ASL market relative to the market for all interpreting services worldwide, and also relative to the global market for all language services. What the graph nicely shows is that while ASL interpreting might be a niche within the wider language industry, it is a much bigger market than one might expect. In fact, you might be thinking that it seems a bit unusual that, according to our estimate, the ASL market makes up between almost 12 to 16% of the market for all interpreting services. But there are 2 things to keep in mind here. And one is that the United States is by far the largest market for interpreting services worldwide, and that ASL is the second largest language within this market, right after Spanish. So it is also worth noting that our estimated size of the ASL market is only for ASL interpreting services in the United States. It does not include interpreting services in other countries that also use ASL, like Canada and many other countries. Okay, so now we know the size and some basic stats. But before we get to the panel discussion, I find it important to talk about some of the key features of the ASL market, because every market is structured so differently, and being aware of the key characteristics of any market is crucial if a company wants to be successful in it. So we're going to take a look. In the United States, the ASL market is highly regulated, and the right to language access for deaf and hard of hearing individuals is protected by the law. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, forms the basis for the provision of services for the deaf. Deaf communities are very well informed and protective of their rights, and compliance with the law is imperative for language service providers and buyers. At the most basic level, the ADA mandates that equal access must be provided in places which are open to the public, and auxiliary aids must be supplied to ensure equal communication is accessible, and that deaf users cannot be charged for these aids and services. It's important to note that the market for ASL interpreting is very much driven by the need to be compliant with ADA regulations. Businesses and public institutions can be held liable if acceptable services are not provided. And many buyers hire interpreters because they need to and not because they want to. So as a result of that, buyers often want services that first and foremost are easy to use. And some businesses consider, for example, the use of captions or written communication an adequate form of communication for deaf people. However, this opinion is not shared by native ASL signers for whom English is not their first language, which is something very important to keep in mind. So then who are the buyers of ASL interpreting services? So of course, ASL can be required in all areas of life, but the largest markets are healthcare and education. Within these sectors, buyers, for example, are hospitals or schools, K-12, or higher education institutions like colleges and universities. Schools tend to employ individual freelance interpreters as needed, usually one interpreter per deaf child for the academic year. Whereas hospitals and universities, on the other hand, are more likely to form groups and award contracts to LSPs together for all their interpreting needs or ASL interpreting needs. That is predominantly because for them, the demand can fluctuate so much as well. And also because outsourcing to an LSP is also a way of sharing the responsibility and the legal risk from a compliance standpoint. So this is something where an LSP can also really add value. The higher education market is growing steadily as more and more deaf students enroll in universities and colleges. And this then, of course, also flows over into the employment market when students graduate and are applying for jobs and entering the workforce. Right now, our research indicates that the demand in the employment sector is still largely limited to the hiring and the onboarding phase. And that often once deaf employees have settled into the workplace, they are left to their own devices and excluded from meetings. And so, of course, this limits them heavily in reaching their full potential at work. But at the same time, we're also seeing a new trend emerging where some ASL interpreters, for example, have started to specialize in the high-tech sector and are providing services for deaf employees in enterprises in Silicon Valley. So macro trends like this might indicate a mindset shift among employers that could potentially translate into a higher demand for ASL services in the employment sector down the line. There's also growing demand in entertainment as simultaneous ASL interpreting enables access for the deaf community to concerts, shows, theater, television broadcasting, and more. The sector is worth keeping an eye on, especially since the potential remains largely untapped so far. Other notable verticals are, of course, also social services and the legal sector. And in addition, it's worth mentioning that the government is the largest employer of deaf people. So this is why there's a high demand for ASL interpreters in Washington, D.C. And we can find a cluster of LSPs here who are competing for the local contracts with federal government. That being said, even here, the contracts tend to be relatively small, because the high-level government agencies usually only hire a handful of individual staff interpreters with contracts worth around $120,000 US. And enterprises like the ones in Silicon Valley tend to do the same and rather hire individuals than engaging LSPs. In general, there are not many large national contracts in the ASL field, even though the ones that do exist tend to go up to even seven figures, for example, from the International Revenue Service, the U.S. Postal Service, the Department of Defense, and a few others in a similar area. Which brings me to the next key feature, which is tied to the previous point as to why there are very few large contracts. And that is that the ASL market is a very, very local one. It is certainly no news that the language services industry in general is very fragmented, but the market for ASL interpreting services is extremely fragmented. There are only a handful of large companies that provide services nationwide, with the biggest ones being, well, Sorensen Community Interpreting and Language Line Solutions. The vast majority of this market is made up of small providers who are specialized in ASL interpreting, or medium to large-sized LSPs who provide a variety of language services and have added ASL to their portfolio to provide services on a local level. And this is due to two main reasons. On the one hand, there's a very strong preference for on-site interpreting, and then it is also essential to have a close connection to the local community. And on-site interpreting tends to be the preference for most languages, but for ASL, this is particularly strong due to the nature of the language, which is three-dimensional. And also because when video remote interpreting was first introduced in the early 2000s, there was a lot of bad experiences around that, which led to, or is still has that effect that the deaf community is largely not so fond of this solution and prefers on-site services. This is also why most LSPs need to be present in the local markets, and the interpreters need to be present in the local markets. And when we asked market players of all sizes who their top competitors are, all of them said that the most significant competition is from small, local, or regional LSPs. So ultimately, this is evidence of the value of local connections in the ASL interpreting market. This importance of community connection stems from the history of discrimination against deaf Americans. Although this has improved significantly, deaf communities are still very protective of their language and human rights. And let's say outsiders can find it difficult to gain trust. Interpreters are generally perceived as allies, but this trust doesn't automatically extend to LSPs. So having close connections in the local community is really important for an LSP to gain trust with its deaf end users. A lack of ties to the local community is probably the main barrier when LSPs try to expand to other locations and ultimately go national. But that being said, a strategy that some LSPs employ to overcome this challenge is by acquiring some of these local mom and pop shops who already have ties to the community. And a number of larger LSPs we talked to told us that they have already started seeing more consolidation in the market and are foreseeing a trend where we will see more M&A activity in the ASL field. Another feature in the ASL market is that much more so than in spoken language interpreting, ASL interpreters have a strong impact on the market. On the one hand, because there's a considerable shortage of interpreters relative to market demand, like we already said, and then because of the need for compliance. So virtually all LSPs in the ASL market work exclusively with interpreters from the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, because certification is, let's say, strongly encouraged. And deaf individuals have the right to sue if the interpreter doesn't hold the certification. So, and of course, not using an interpreter is not an option either because of compliance with the ADA. So what this means is that interpreters are a rare commodity, and they are aware of this as well. And they tend to be very well organized and form a united front when it comes to working conditions and rates, and there's very little room for negotiation. So this then creates an interpreter-driven market where LSPs kind of have to go the extra mile to stand out as an employer of choice. And as you will recall, having close ties with the community is very important, and often that's also done through the ASL interpreters. So this all comes back full circle. And we will come back to this later in the panel discussion. Last but not least, I want to briefly talk about some of the challenges in this unique field. There are many, but I think one that ties it well together for now, at least, is this one. And that is that in the ASL market, the buyers and the end users of interpreting services are not the same people, and both have vastly different requirements and motivations. So subsequently, as a provider, it can be challenging to keep both parties happy. And in many cases, it is difficult to convince buyers that ASL interpreting services are necessary at all, much less that quality services are worth investing in. But at the same time, end users must be provided with adequate services. And this is then further complicated by the fact that deaf people are inclined to also take legal action if they feel that they do not receive suitable services. Having a national organization to defend deaf rights, the National Association of the Deaf, NAD, means that there's often considerable support for deaf people taking this course of action. And it's worth pointing out that this is one major difference to the market for spoken language interpreting, because there's no association that actively protects the right to language access for non-English native speakers. So there's a big difference here in the market that way. So finding the right balance that keeps both parties happy is a challenge that LSPs in the ASL market must learn to navigate. And when trying to sell ASL interpreting services, the best strategy for LSPs is to remind buyers of a need to comply with the law, as well as to explain that improper communication can potentially cause severe harm, especially in medical and legal settings. And it can also be worth stressing that partnering with an LSP who knows the ASL market well can significantly reduce the risk of non-compliance with the ADA. Okay, I feel like I've talked enough now. There's been a lot of information crammed into this, so I'm sorry if that was a bit fast. That was just a very brief introduction to the ASL market. And I think that's, like I said, there's been enough of me. I want to hear from our guests now. So I will start the panel discussion. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Like I said, I have a few questions prepared, but please also feel free to post your own questions in the chat, and we will do our best to address as many of those as possible. So I will just kick it off with my first question here, if that's okay. The first question here is for Robin. So Robin, we mentioned in our report that it is essential for an LSP to have close ties to the deaf community. It's the reason why the majority of LSPs in this field are very small, and we don't see a lot of national players. And it can also be a barrier to entry in this field if someone doesn't have this connection. You, as being deaf yourself and also being the owner of an LSP, can you maybe elaborate a little bit why it is so important for an LSP to have a close relationship with the deaf community if someone wants to provide ASL interpreting services?
Yes. So you have to understand that there are no two deaf people alike. So for example, take me and my wife. We both have very different communication needs and different preferences. I like interpreters that have really good ability to catch my fast signing and are able to interpret it into English. There are other different interpreters that have different skills. My wife, for example, is very fluent in ASL, and she prefers interpreters that match that. So that same is true for other deaf professionals. When I meet deaf professionals, I often ask them what their priorities are, what they need out of interpreters, and I match them with the right interpreter because we want to make sure that the interpreter has a good fit for that deaf person and that deaf person feels comfortable with their interpreter. Most LSPs typically will put the next available interpreter with the next job. And so typically that gives the deaf professional frustration because they often are not very fit to that interpreter. And that interpreter could also be a much better interpreter in a different situation if they had the right fit. So it's really important for an LSP to know the deaf professional first and then match them with the appropriate interpreter because it gives a positive experience for everybody in that way.
Okay. Thank you very much for that explanation. Yeah, it's a really, really good point. And also I think there's, well, judging by my own experience as well, there's so much that people like me, I didn't have any contact with the sign language market before. I'm a trained interpreter, but for spoken languages. And, there's a lot more to consider when it comes to sign language interpreting. And yeah, these are all excellent points. And it's probably it's a good example of things that people might not even consider before they go into this market or before they try to match to people because it's very different in spoken language.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to add one more thing to my point. So this is not the first time, and it will not always be the last, but with other LSP owners, if they want to succeed in a market like this, they need to hire a deaf consultant because they can use their cultural and linguistic experience to help that LSP succeed. And that just saves a lot of money in the long run. And it may cost a bit upfront, but in the long run, the benefit is massive. So, and it makes deaf people happy too.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. That's very good advice. So my next question would be for Joshua. So one thing I did not mention during the presentation at all yet was, well, I briefly alluded to video remote interpreting, but we didn't talk much about the use of technology. So one thing we haven't mentioned at all are video relay services. Sorensen the Interpreting is the largest provider of VRS. Can you maybe briefly explain what VRS is and how it is different from VRI, and why the use of technology is a bit controversial in the ASL field?
Sure. So Sorensen Communications is the largest provider, like you said, of video relay service. And basically, for those who are joining from around the world, because of the ADA that Sarah mentioned, part of the ADA is a title that requires telecommunication accessibility for deaf people. And as video technology improved, part of what that meant became interpreted video calls. So think about anything that you might make a telephone call for. Calling the pharmacy to see if your prescription is ready for pickup. Calling your child's school to see if inclement weather means the school will be closed. Calling loved ones, accessing 911 for an emergency call. So all these things are part of what's incorporated in the ADA as a right for deaf people to access. It's funded at the federal level, and it's regulated at the federal level and provided by a number of small to large private companies. And so, like I mentioned, Sorensen is the biggest provider of that. Video remote interpreting is a large umbrella of everything else that's not a telephone call. And those types of interpreted situations are privately paid. They're also mandated by the ADA, but the responsibility to provide them goes down to the employer, the doctor's practice, whoever it is that's operating that business. And so, for example, right now we're having a VRI experience, right? Yeah. So I assume Nimdzi paid for interpreting services today. This is not part of any federally funded program. So that's kind of the main difference. With COVID, we see so much more VRI because everyone is virtual. Mm-hmm. Remote interpreting works really well when everybody is remote. Right? Yes. Everybody's on the equal playing field. There's not a problem with accessing audio in some room where everybody's together. So these type situations we see more and more, and I expect we'll see growth even in the future of this type of interpreting. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about the technology, and I'll let Robin address the issue of deaf consumer preference and why there may be a dispreference for VRI in certain circumstances, but there are a couple of things that are important to note. And if you hear all the horns, I forgot to say in my introduction, I live in New York City, so sorry about that. But there are a couple of kind of important factors to consider when you're providing VRI. One is the technology itself. Most technology that companies use to provide VRI is a refitting of a technology developed for hearing people to speak to each other and see their faces.
Yeah.
Right. So what happens when you have poor bandwidth is the audio is privileged in the stream and the video cuts out. As you can imagine, that's a big problem for VRI for a signed language. There are other important considerations like how many lumens are required to have a visible hands and face. Part of meaning the light, how much light you need, right?
Yeah.
How many frames per second the video stream is producing. Like all these types of things are really important for the ability not just to see the hands, but the eyebrows where there's grammatical information, the lips. Like all of this needs to be conveyed clearly and without major interruptions. So because of all that reason, what we've done at Sorensen from the beginning has been to develop our own hardware. And so we have an engineering team that includes deaf engineers. So from design through implementation, the video hardware and software that we use is designed to accommodate the need for sign language. So that's kind of one important thing is the technology itself needs to be made to fit.
Yeah.
And then, the second thing is that VRI has often been marketed as a replacement for on-site interpreting services. And that's a real problem. VRI originally, I think when it was developed, was thought of as this great supplement. Like now when there are all these places where it's impossible or impractical to have an on-site interpreter, now we can add in somebody on video. And what happened instead was that the on-site part was dialed back. And so when that happens, when a customer does a video-only contract, for example, what happens when, we don't have a monolithic deaf community, right? So what happens when there's a deaf person who's deaf blind?
Yeah.
They can't access VRI. There are other groups within the deaf community, and there are a lot of circumstances where it's just not the right fit. So, I'd say those two things of technology and VRI being able to be a solution and not the solution that's driven by what the deaf consumer needs at the time are really important to making VRI successful.
Yeah, very, very good points. And I liked what you explained as well, that, most video conferencing and VRI was, kind of designed with hearing people in mind to make phone calls and not so much with deaf people in mind. And so that maybe we as hearing people think, well, that should work fine, but we don't think of all these other aspects that you mentioned, like that the video is the first thing to go, and that then there's only audio, and that you need to see different things and have a clear image and everything. So that makes complete sense. And again, it's just something that, if someone explains it to you, it makes complete sense. But beforehand, maybe people don't think of it as much, which is a shame, and it should be more thought of. But it's probably the reality. And that's why probably also Robin said you want to have a deaf consultant, for example, right? So yeah, that makes sense to me. And I agree also with the marketing aspect. When I look at the interpreting market overall, I keep talking about how I think remote interpreting can expand the interpreting market. So rather than being like a replacement, but like hit areas where, maybe previously there was no interpreting, or, maybe it can replace smaller things here and there, but certainly not a full replacement, but more of an opportunity to expand into other areas as well. So yeah, Robin, exactly. What's your view on this?
Yeah, I want to talk shortly about supply versus demand. Before COVID-19 hit us, the supply was pretty big. The demand was, the demand was bigger and the supply was pretty low in the Bay Area specifically. And so we were struggling to fill jobs on a consistent basis. And so if we had maybe less than a week's notice, it was almost impossible to find an interpreter. So we needed a 2 to 3 week lead time. Once COVID-19 happened, VRI, we've had those services set up, but if somebody wants an on-site interpreter, we are able to provide that. However, like if you start thinking like this, if we can't have an on-site interpreter, we have an alternate approach. We can use video remote interpreting. Now, in the Bay Area, many of the interpreters are coming back on-site to do jobs, but we're also having really incredible interpreters that we can access from all over the country, perhaps where there's less deaf people and less. So now these are people that are available for VRI work. So I see the supply and demand balancing out more now after COVID.
That's a really good point. I like what you said as well about maybe providing, maybe on the one hand, accessing interpreters in places where there aren't as many, or, providing services in areas where there aren't as many interpreters. And that is exactly what it also should be used for, right? Yeah. So, and I do think that as horrible as COVID has been and still is, that when we look at the language industry, there's some good that's coming out of it, that there is more. I've seen a lot of innovation. People have tried things that were afraid to try before, and we can see different use cases now, not just in this market, but in general. And again, I hope that this will overall expand the market, right? And that we can, because ultimately the goal should be to provide equal access, language access in as many places as possible, right? And so this can be maybe a way to go more in that direction. Robin, in this same vein, still the same kind of area of the question, are there other cases where you could see more opportunity for remote services where there are none yet, or other areas where you feel like this could maybe expand the market?
Josh?
Sure. So, I think in employment, for example, there's opportunity to increase what's often missed with, the water cooler talk. the things that happen in the office in between the weekly staff meeting that in the past many deaf consumers didn't have access to.
Mm-hmm.
So in my mind, VRI, for example, is a great solution for those kind of short conversations, one-on-ones, intermediary to kind of the big events where you might have interpreting. So we're keeping an eye to see, does that sort of thing increase? But that's one great example of where VRI services would be an addition to an augmentation of, be a value add over what's currently being provided.
Yeah, that's a great example. Thank you. Robin, anything to add, or otherwise I'll ask the next question?
Yeah, I do want to add a quick comment. In general, on an economic level, deaf people are behind the hearing community. That means our capability to start up different businesses is pretty less. So if I were to say there's a conference I wanted to attend, it's harder for me to personally attend because of services, a lack of services. But now with VRI, our access to information has greatly improved. I'm able to access a conference remotely. I'm able to access my interpreting services remotely. So that's a big area of growth. Mm-hmm. So the minimum cost and the minimum hours for on-site versus VRI interpreting services are different. So deaf people can now say, hey, you know what, I can afford video remote interpreting because the cost is more effective than an on-site interpreter. So it allows deaf professionals to start up businesses a lot easier now.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really good point as well. Thank you.
Yeah, and Robin tagged on a really important growth area right now, which is the virtual conference. Mm-hmm. So it's interesting to see what will happen once we're all allowed to have 5,000 people in a ballroom again. Will these virtual conferences continue as they are right now? But that's certainly been an area where you've seen some really important thought leaders, like say a Microsoft, to go all access on their online conferences, right? So in the typical pre-COVID conference world, you're a deaf person, you go to a conference, you get a team of interpreters who's assigned to you, they go where you go, right? With virtual conferences, we're starting to see conferences be made fully accessible end to end, and the provider is agnostic to whether or not there's a deaf person in the audience, which means not just a team of interpreters like we have today, but also captioning services as well. So that's been an area of growth during COVID, and I'm excited to see what's next as things go back to normal or go back to a hybrid normal, whether or not that kind of all access continues.
Well, at the very least, I would assume that this has at least increased awareness, and that therefore it should continue, I would say, to be offered, even if maybe the number of occasions might be less because we have maybe some fewer virtual conferences. But then when they do happen, or when there's a hybrid conference, that then there is more awareness for this as well. So hopefully, anyway. I have another question for Robin. And so in our report, we, as one of the trends, we mentioned certified deaf interpreters that I didn't mention at all in my presentation now, because I figured maybe you can tell us a bit better what exactly CDI is and what they do, in which scenarios they used.
Sure. So a CDI stands for Certified Deaf Interpreter, and that would be a deaf person who works as an interpreter. So say I'm a client and I had a hearing person that was speaking to me. A hearing interpreter would interpret what a hearing person is saying to the deaf interpreter. The deaf interpreter would then sign to me in my native language. Now, most hearing people don't understand why you would add a deaf interpreter to the mix if you already have a hearing interpreter. My answer always kind of goes back to think about a native speaker, the same as for native signers. There are many hearing interpreters out there that are very passionate about learning sign language and are really good at pursuing that, but they will never reach the level of a native signer like a deaf person. So when I watch a hearing person sign, my brain is actually working harder than it is when I'm watching a deaf person sign.
Mm-hmm.
I can literally feel my brain relaxing when I'm watching a deaf interpreter sign to me. Now, disclaimer, I started using CDIs maybe like 3 or 4 years ago. So it wasn't until I watched a CDI on stage doing their work is something that just kind of hit me. I was like, what have I been missing out on? Right. So that's one reason why it's so important. It's that native fluency. So also another reason is think about the 1 million deaf individuals in the country. And then think about all of the and then we have 10% of those people are educated. The 90% of those deaf community members do not have an education, and they rely on ASL to communicate. They don't have fluency in English. So that means that captioning is not accessible to them. Mm-hmm. If you have a hearing person that's signing and maybe is using more of an English word order in their signs, these certain deaf people will have a hard time accessing what they're signing. Perhaps their facial expressions are a little bit more limited and they're not able to quite understand it. A certified deaf interpreter is able to give that fluency and able to give that whole body language, including those facial features that are important. When we had wildfires a few years ago, we had CDIs finally making appearances in different newscasts. And so we were able to see the success of people accessing CDIs. Another example is going to a doctor's appointment. If, say, there's a deaf person at the doctor's appointment and the doctor says, hey, you know what? You have your high cholesterol. I need you to stop eating meat. Mm-hmm.
Red meat.
Sorry, red meat specifically. So the doctor sends them on their way and then they come back and they say the cholesterol's still high. Why have you not stopped eating red meat? When we bring a CDI into the mix and we ask a little bit more and see what it is that they're eating, and they're able to clarify and they're able to give examples, CDI is able to give more visual clues between red meat and what meat is in general. So the CDI is able to give more context and able to translate clearer so deaf individuals can understand and access what is going on.
That red meat didn't just mean rare meat.
Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much. That's again, this makes complete sense. And like you said, I can understand how maybe at first as a hearing person, we don't get it. Like, why would you need another interpreter in there? But yeah, it makes complete sense thinking of it as well with the native speaker difference and coming from this point of view, and that maybe in some, especially in also situations, either where it needs to be very precise or maybe where someone's in emotional distress as well, that you want to have another native signer there rather than someone who has a strong accent and or doesn't have the cultural background and all these differences there. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, I already mentioned during the presentation that ASL interpreters have a lot of influence on the market, at least relative to spoken language interpreters, because where there's a need for compliance, but at the same time a lack of certified interpreters, and ASL interpreters often also bridge the gap between an LSP and the local deaf community. But we recently received feedback from an ASL interpreter who disagreed with the statement and said that the market was far more LSP driven, actually. And of course, for our report, we also spoke to ASL interpreters. So it's certainly not the only ASL interpreter we heard from, but I still wanted to address this during this webinar and just kind of get your perspective. What do you think? Is the market more LSP driven, ASL interpreter driven, driven by the end users? I mean, I'd say ultimately there's a lot of stakeholders that all drive the market together, but just what is your point of view on this?
Okay, I'll go first. Yeah, I think it's option C that you mentioned, which is that the market is driven by the consumer. In that, as you talked about with the ADA and with Canada also, they just enacted the Accessible Canada Act, which is similar in many ways to the ADA. So with people being able to exercise their rights, to engage in broader society in a deeper way, to advance their careers, and demand these rights for interpreting services, that just the demand overall has continued to grow and explode. Now, interpreters are, the supply of interpreters is not commensurate with the demand, right? We've already kind of talked about that. But as an interpreter, and as somebody who's been in the community of interpreters for a long time, what I see is less about price discussion and more about values. Yeah. So kind of the gateway question that I see people asking before they consider working with an LSP is, does this LSP align with my value set? And one of the things that's somewhat unique about this pool of people is that we serve the community and we live in the community, right? So many interpreters have family members, spouses, parents that are deaf and that are consumers of the service. And so they're also a stakeholder in it. And they also have to show up at Deaf Bowling on Friday night and account for their decisions and whether or not them aligning with a certain company has helped or harmed the community. And so I think that value discussion is really the most important part. And of course, with any supply demand issue, there's conversation around rates of pay and what that looks like. But really the gateway question I think a lot of companies struggle with is the misalignment of values.
Okay, that's very well put. Anything to add there, Robin?
I think there's an emotional perspective also. I've seen some interpreters out there who show up to work and then they have a bad experience. And then that ruins their whole entire week, right? So if we put an interpreter with the wrong type of deaf person, then that kind of, ruins their week. So I see emotional turmoil that occurs in interpreters and with the deaf individuals. So I want to be there to help make it successful to everybody. So I want to make sure that we trust the LSPs to put the right interpreter with the right deaf person.
Okay, thank you. I have more questions on my list, but I know we're already 10 minutes away from closing. So I still want to also address some questions from the audience. I only see 2 here for now, but you can still pose your questions. But in the meantime, we're going to address those. So the first one I have here is someone asking, what is suggested when there is no ASL interpreter in a specific area and video does not work as an option? What are alternate options?
I think it really just depends on the scenario. If it's a medical appointment, then that requires a certain solution. If it's a work-related situation, that requires a specific solution. Many deaf people, not all, are willing to kind of be flexible and go communicate through text or through technology. They can write back and forth on paper, but it goes back to the specific scenario that we are in. So if it's a medical appointment, maybe it necessitates using pen and paper to communicate. Is that acceptable? No, but in a pinch, it could work, but it depends on the scenario. Say I'm a deaf professional or I'm a deaf entrepreneur. I may be able to change over to Slack and communicate through a text-based program. That's an option. But again, it's really situation dependent.
Yeah, so really just when the situation is that dire, really.
And it's not cheap, but sometimes we do have to ask interpreters to travel to communities where there are none that exist. And you're right. There's people tend to organize around population centers, and sometimes there are rural communities where you really have to have an on-site on-site interpreter. Maybe there's no internet access. Maybe it's VRI just doesn't work for that, and so interpreters are, by and large, care about the outcome and the impact of these services. And in my experience, with reimbursement for their expenses, many interpreters are willing to go into some of these underserved communities and provide their services. Yeah.
I suppose that this kind of solution, and it's a very common one, of course, also even in spoken language interpreting, and a lot of interpreters travel also. It works when the event is planned, but then of course you have emergency situations as well, right? Like, I don't know, potentially you could be in a remote community somewhere and someone has a heart attack and needs to go to the hospital, or I don't know what. And again, this can also happen with spoken language interpreting, but in general, it's there's, I would assume, always the what we want to achieve, what is ideal, what is accepted, and then there's the exception to the rule where everything fails and you need to have some form of communication. Sure, those cases are more rare, but I guess in those cases you would resort probably to something what Robin mentioned with a pen and paper, if the person is able to write still, depending on what state they're in, but I guess that's where humans get creative, which I know has nothing to do much with the provision of ASL interpreting services now. That's more of a general comment. So anyway, the next question. Here's someone saying, first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. And I have a question. I was doing some research recently and noticed a possible emergence of an automated ASL interpreting solution, like a Google Translate of sorts for ASL. What is the opinion of the deaf community in a technological pursuit such as this?
I'll answer that question. So the reaction is quite mixed in the deaf community. I will just give you my personal opinion first and then speak to the general community's experience. In the early 1990s, we heard rumors saying that, video relay is going to be happening. We were all kind of not sure what that would look like, right? We made fun of video relay service interpreting, and we thought, how are we going to do that? It's so expensive, so much technology. We typically initially react with doubt and a little bit of negativity. But now in this year, 2021, we're using Zoom. It's a total hearing product. It was not made for deaf people in mind. But almost 30 years later, since the onset of video service interpreting, the technology is maturing. And so our reaction has shifted as well. So I think we can fill some gaps with emerging technologies, some small gaps. It could be like maybe the third option, plan C, if you will, if plan A and B fail. But when we look 20 to 30 years down the road, there's bigger potential for these technologies to fill in those gaps. When I look at it from an economic perspective, we have 1 million deaf people. Now think about the revenue and profit from this population. Look at Zoom, right? Zoom is available for all people to use. So that has more economic incentive to make the product better, right? So I'm not quite sure if the economic incentive is there to invest in ASL technology to see returns in that way. So I'm still not sure about that.
Excellent points. Thank you.
I'll just add in too really quickly to point folks to the World Federation of the Deaf, which is kind of federation of the NADs of the world, has a position statement out on signing avatars. That's an interesting read too that you could check out.
Perfect. Thanks for that. Also want to quickly just read out a comment here from Jacqueline Evans saying, thank you. I think we need to foster more LSPs or agencies working with students learning ASL interpretation. And she's also saying, I want to start mobile ASL interpreters in the US. Anyone want to join? So connect with Jacqueline if you're interested. And here from an anonymous attendee, we have, isn't there a significant difference between traditional VRI, where the interpreters are co-located? Interlocutors are located and the interpreter is remote. I don't know if I'm reading that right. My apologies. And pandemic VRI, where all participants are remote. I think actually, Joshua, you were mentioning that earlier. what problems do you foresee as people return in person and try to continue to rely on VRI that is no longer a suitable solution?
Joshua, I'll let you go ahead and speak to this.
Yeah, probably many of us has been in the experience where we're the only person calling into a meeting where everybody else is together, and it's hard, right? So I agree with the sentiment that the technology as it existed pre-pandemic is hard to interpret in those situations where there's a group on site together. So we'll have to take a hard look at what really works and what doesn't as things start to go into a hybrid scenario. I think that's one we don't really have a good understanding of, right? When 3 people are in the room and 3 are on video, what happens in those dynamics? That's something I think we're all learning together. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
And as a deaf person, I, have done remote meetings where I've worked from home or did telehealth and had a doctor's appointment and had an interpreter on the screen with me. That basically forced the doctor's office to use remote interpreting services. And so it was a big benefit to me as a deaf person because I was able to access so much more, and I was hoping it would stay the same. I feel like it saves the doctor's office a lot of time and headache because there are some places. So now I'm hoping in the future things stay the same in some aspects and we don't go backwards.
Thank you for that perspective as well. Let's see if there's one more question. Oh, there's one more comment. I think we just about have time for that. Your research does lean heavily towards the LSP and LSB perspective, having only gathered data from 4 ASL interpreters and 3 deaf and hard of hearing people. Yes. Since many LSPs are owned or run by ASL interpreters or deaf individuals, your panelists being good examples, was effort put towards making sure that the ASL interpreters and deaf and hard of hearing people consulted were not affiliated with an LSP. Well, okay, clearly that's a question for me. And so I'm going to address that one. Yes, it is true. It's very heavily leaning towards LSPs and LSBs, our report, because we were looking at the market from a business perspective. And it was predominantly, about that, who are the bigger providers, who are the buyers. But we wanted to make sure that we don't only get the perspectives of the LSP. So while it was very much focused on that, that's why we did also reach out to ASL interpreters and deaf people. It was a mix. There were some associated with an LSP. I think really only one person, though, to be honest, if I'm not misremembering. And the other ones were, like, for example, freelance interpreters or just deaf people that were referred to us as well. So I hope that answers that question. Okay, so it's perfectly on the hour now, and I think we discussed a lot. Thank you both so much for joining me for the webinar, and for everyone else for joining. I really, really appreciate it. I learned a lot. I had a good time. Any parting words from either one of you?
I think just to reiterate Robin and my comment both of if you want to be involved in the space, having deaf input in the design and decision making from end to end is really critical. And so I would ask people to consider that.
I agree with Joshua. And thank you so much, Sarah, for having us here. I hope that this is something we can continue in the future and share more information with.
I would love that. Thank you very much. So that's the end of our webinar. I hope you all enjoyed it, and see you again. And read the report on our website. Bye.
Thank you to the interpreters as well.
See you all. Bye.
Bye, everyone.